Welcome to This Week in Cannabis Live. I am Jay Rosenthal. Oh, shit. That is Jeremy Burke. Across from me, down below, that's Ben Larson. And that is Mark Hauser. Mark, of course, from Cannabis Musings. Ben from High Spirits. And Jeremy is my co-founder, but our editor-in-chief here at Cultivated. Welcome, everybody.
You nailed it that time, Jay. You got it all right.
It's looking at yourself and pointing the other way, which is quite challenging. But
Yeah.
One of these weeks, I'll get it entirely perfect. There is I'm going to say some positive news this week coming out of a state I think we did talk about last week, but the Virginia legislature did pass bills, and they are, I guess, sitting on Governor Spanberger's desk to legalize cannabis in Virginia. I would say this is good news as the line of legalization moves further south, closer to the Mason-Dixon line, but also bad news if you are an operator in DC and maybe an operator in Maryland too. Mark, it's another state, maybe soon.
Maybe, I mean, just like a deal is never closed until the wire hits, a law is never passed until it's, it's actually signed by the governor or the president. But no, I mean, look, and I wrote yesterday or this morning actually about, and sort of teeing off our conversation last week about how, there's just been this real pushback from a lot of different fronts on the industry, but Virginia is the exception to that. But it's also been a long time coming. I mean, this has been, it's been a long road for Virginia, but it's great to see, at the tape.
Yeah. Ben, before you go, I want to hear your thoughts about Virginia as well. But Jeremy, I want you to think about this too, because I think last time it was on the governor's desk or was being considered in legislature, there was some deal that might legalize cannabis, but only if the Wizards and the Capitals were going to build a stadium in Northern Virginia. I swear it was all wrapped in together, but that doesn't surprise me at often. The sauce.
I think it was the Commanders Stadium. Was that it? I do vaguely recall.
It was definitely wrapped up in pro sports, which makes sense. Ben, I mean, any state coming online or about to come online or about to be passed seems like good news. Yeah.
I think it's generally good news. It's especially ones that are more southern leaning, as you indicated. As a West Coaster, I always kind of chuckle when new states come online in the East Coast, because there's so many border states that do get influenced by either the momentum of legalization or how that affects the border dispensaries.
So, I actually think there was a story today, maybe not even in our newsletter yet, about the governor of Indiana saying that they're going to have to do something because all the states that border it are not legal. And so I don't think he was saying we're going to legalize weed. He definitely didn't use those words, but that is interesting that even Indiana, which is the most conservative, has to do something, I think, or something along those lines. Right, Jared?
Yeah, you preempted my point, so thank you for that, Jay. But no, I'm kidding. No, so I the point I was going to make was twofold. Is one, the former Republican governor of Virginia twice vetoed legislature that was supported, by Virginians as well as the legislature, and so I think this is, while this is a good moment for the cannabis industry, it's a long time coming, and I think that political reality is finally catching up to where the legislature is and where the people are of Virginia. I think too, this has sort of been something that I've wanted to write about for a long time. And to get to the preemption point, Virginia is surrounded by DC, Delaware, Maryland, right? At a certain point, it will make sense for a lot of states to harmonize their regulations and tax policy. And I know that in the Northeast, there's been some push to do this that sort of didn't go anywhere between Connecticut and New York. And so, look, like I'm interested to see in the Mid-Atlantic with all these tightly clustered states if there is another push to do that, because, I'm sure that the regulators in Virginia don't want to leave tax revenue on the table. DC is its own beast because it's governed by Congress, and Congress is Republican controlled for now. But I think there's an interesting dynamic at play. And so, besides, it's good for the cannabis market, cannabis stocks that Virginia's coming online. I'm interested to see where policy goes, because I think there's sort of a ripe area to have this discussion again.
Jared, can I stay with you for a second? Because something you wrote about in response to what the New York Times wrote about, and in response to that, Ohio State's sort of policy arm from the law school also looked at this, and it was about taxes, not Texas, taxes, and how they impact legalization, and that there is this threshold whereby, especially the sort of most avid consumers of cannabis, will go back to the illicit market. Talk a little bit about sort of what prompted you to write and sort of what was written this week, because I think it does also go into the conversation certainly about harmonization of taxes, but also level of taxes and what it means for cannabis.
Yeah, so keep in mind that I got a C plus in my econ class during my MBA. So I may I may mess up some of the language here, but I think it's twofold, right? One was just the general notion of the New York Times editorial board. I have very high standards for them. I'm a New York Times reader. I've been my entire life. They have a lot of access to people and information and network to get things correct. They got this wrong, right? And I think I wrote that and I wrote that in a sort of qualitative way right after the piece came out. The thrust of the piece that I really took issue with, was that they suggest using high taxes to dissuade cannabis consumers from A, consuming cannabis in the first place, and B, from consuming higher potency products. While that does make sense on its face, tax policy is a really good way to guide consumer behavior. It didn't really understand how the cannabis market functions. There is an illicit market that consistently and repeatedly undercuts the legal market time and time again. They don't have to pay compliance costs. They don't have to pay taxes. They can simply sell cannabis for $1 less than the legal dispensary down the street. And the supply chains are all there. Anyone who consumes cannabis and is that price conscious probably has access to a dealer or that supply in the first place. And so I think they very much misunderstood how the market works, and the fact that cannabis is very, very substitutable, as much as a lot of brands we talk to would say otherwise. At a certain point, if you want to consume cannabis and you consume cannabis regularly, you're going to look for the cheapest option, and the cheapest option being the most THC for the least dollar possible. And so, I thought the New York Times editorial board really got this wrong. Higher taxes on cannabis will simply inflate the illicit market rather than guide consumer behavior in the right way. And now there are plenty of things, and I alluded to this, I'm not a regulator, I'm not a policymaker. And so, I don't know if there's a silver bullet here, but I think there's a lot of ways to guide consumer behavior if that is the policy goal of a legal cannabis program, in ways that aren't taxing it so heavily, in ways that aren't destroying businesses and pushing consumers back to the illicit market. I think New York, where the New York Times was like a very, very clear example of this. And if there was, a little bit of an iota of curiosity on the New York Times editorial board to really understand cannabis consumers, how they behave in cannabis businesses, they would not have gotten it so wrong. And so, I wrote that right when the New York Times editorial board piece came out. They didn't publish my response. Go figure. And then I was glad to see that the DEPC, a think tank or policy group within OSU, they sort of put data to my claims, and I was happy to see that the data actually did support my claims, because you never know. But
C plus.
Yeah, they right. They basically they showed that higher taxes doesn't really change usage rates, right? And so that was a pretty clear, I think, indication. Well, it's not a perfect one-to-one correlation. It's pretty clear indication to me that higher taxes are not a way to dissuade people from higher potency cannabis, and in fact can be a wealth transfer to the illicit market itself. And so it's a poorly designed policy choice, to say the least. And I wanted to put my foot in the ground and write that.
Yeah.
I think that the biggest challenge we face is that they're trying to solve multiple problems at once without having a functional marketplace, right? Like the rubric has been written since like the 1930s, right? Like toward liquor control, which was funded by the John D. Rockefeller, written by Raymond Fosdick and Albert Scott. Like, just really, it clearly states that like you need to lower the barriers of entry to eliminate the illicit market, to force people into a legal marketplace. And then once it's there, and we've seen this with cigarettes, we've seen it with alcohol, then you can apply the use taxes to kind of control like consumers. But like, you can't do that if you don't have a functional marketplace yet. It'll just not happen.
It's essentially like I wrote like it's essentially a deadweight loss tax. If you've taken an econ class, you know what that means. It's like, we have enough evidence to show that like we should not impose these taxes if we want to prop up the legal market in the right way. Now, that may not be the goal of these legal cannabis regimes, right? Certainly there are other goals other than economic growth and development and promoting business. I that's sort of where I land, right? That I think that is the primary goal of a legal cannabis regime. Now, it may not be for some regulators and policymakers, but if it is the goal, right, if you're working for first principles, like imposing a deadweight loss tax is silly, right? Like it's a simple thing that a C+ in an econ class could point out, so.
And I also wonder too, even with that editorial to me and some of the articles that have been written recently, it's not totally clear to me what are the problems that this kind of thing is trying to solve. In the first place, is it access if it's access to cannabis for kids, then I would argue the licensed market actually does a pretty good job with that. And it could always do better, but making it more, the product more expensive doesn't fix that. That's not, those are two different it's a wrong solution for the wrong problem. And it's, but beyond that, is it just lets people get less cannabis? That's not really an answer. And, or is it, let's solve this, this mysterious question about, about that some people, it affects them medically, there's deleterious effects, but that, that's not solved by this by this solution either. Let's figure out, is it actually a problem? Who is it hurting? And, and is there another way to solve that? I don't know. It's just,
I think the other thing, and I think this is not a surprise. I don't think the industry, like propping up or launching a successful in-state industry, falls so far down on that priority list that it's like, it's, and we had a webinar about this week about the challenge with price compression in New York. I'm not sure if you go to regulators and say the price is falling so fast, like that actually solves one of the policy goals that they're concerned about, right? Which is like getting people in the legal market, which is what Ben just said, right? Like, if it's cheaper for people to buy cannabis in the legal market, that actually is a policy goal. It is just contrary to a policy goal, which might be launching a successful industry in a state, right? They're contradictory in and of itself.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here and stop soapboxing. Like I think it's
Never.
Wait,
yeah.
How do you
it just
stop soapboxing?
Afterwards, I will stop soapboxing. Yeah,
it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think it's twofold, right? One is that I think there's a lot of confusion in general about what the actual policy goals of legal cannabis programs are in the first place, right? And you can see that, historically, right? In 2018 in Canada, Justin Trudeau, it was public health, right? It was keeping cannabis outside of kids' hands. And in 2021 in New York, it was basically, social justice and social equity coming out of, the BLM protests, George Floyd protests. Economic growth, job creation was sort of incidental to the criminal justice piece. Now, whether it should have been or shouldn't have been, I don't know. Jury's out, but it certainly was incidental. And so now I think we are seeing a lot of well-coordinated, well-funded pushback on these public health issues. And so regulators are trying to get out in front of that very quickly. And I think the cannabis industry itself, should also get out in front of that. Now, Mark, to your point, I think a lot of these public health issues are not only overblown, but almost invented, right? When you look at rates of psychosis, et cetera, and all these things that, the New York Times editorial board calls out as risks, like they are like, a single-digit percentage of the total population. And when you add cannabis into the analysis, it raises that by like, a tenth of a percentage point. Like we're talking about basis points here. And so, I personally don't make decisions based on risk. If I'm going to, if I have a 0.07% chance of dying in a plane crash, I'm probably going to get on the flight, right? And I think that like we should think about that in terms of cannabis more holistically, right? Like these things are risks, sure. There are documented impacts, but they're not they do not override the fact that like there are other policy goals that we should be focused on, which are getting people to buy legal, job growth, allowing businesses to be going concerns. So the point's well taken, Mark. I just think it's there's this well-funded opposition that is infecting the information environment about cannabis policy in very negative ways.
Yes.
100%.
100%. I want to move on if I could. I want to go to New York because we had an interesting webinar this week around price compression, which we talk about a fair amount on this program and others. And we had Lit Alerts talk about sort of what the pricing pressure was in New York and like where it actually sits. And in some categories, especially in the flower categories, it sounds 7 to 8% in a quarter. So it's actually quite a lot, quarter over quarter. But we also featured a brand and a retailer. The retailer was Cause Marti at Conbud, and the brand was Flamer, which is in New York. And Wyatt Harms, who's a friend of the pod, I would say, said this about what he's trying to do, which is bring in more people into the market as a way to fight price compression. Here you go.
Market trends and like what we can. I think like taking a step back and just thinking about the broader market trends and like what we can think about as a market to push back on this price compression. One thing I really want to add to this conversation is we can expand the market. One way to combat falling prices is to increase demand. And I think I don't want us as New York Cannabis to look at where we are today and be complacent and decide that this is the audience that we have to reach, and let's keep discounting for these existing buyers until they are somehow brand loyal because I've given them the lowest price. That's not going to work. What's going to work is us bringing in new people to the market. Like right now, what New York is doing as a market is not its full potential.
There were a lot of nods on the webinar, I could tell, but he was basically saying they do a lot of work out of store to bring new people into the market, because that way, one, they're not the sort of 20% who buy 80% of the cannabis, but they are net new consumers. They have a role in sort of keeping prices where they are. I thought it was interesting, and we don't often talk about that. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I've been complaining about the industry in my music for like 6 years now. That the same point that there's the industry sort of when a state goes live, it taps out, eventually satisfies the base consumers that are built in, and it really has had this problem expanding that consumer base. Part of that is regulatory and the lack of advertising, and it being a tough product to sort of learn about and understand. I think a lot of it is form factors, and a lot of people don't like to smoke. And so if you are new to cannabis, it's hard to bring those people in, which then, beverages is a great solution to it, I think. You're welcome, Ben. And, but no, I mean that jokingly, but seriously, like, I think that there is it's a hard problem. But I think it's a spot on, I think it's a spot on criticism.
We know it's hard for Jeremy to understand because he said increased demand, and Jeremy's a C+ econ student. But Ben, but you often talk about this sort of bringing new people into the market and entry points. Now, Flamer is I think it's mostly a pre-roll brand, premium pre-roll brand. But talk a little bit about that. And is it both about bringing people into the dispensary model, or is there something to, if we could only access them outside the dispensary model, low dose beverage type ways? Like I think there is pushback from the sort of dispensary model to that, but is that one thing to think about in this conversation?
I mean, I get what he's saying. I think we're going to be having this discussion for many, many years. This is like an inevitable cycle in any growing market. And I think, we've talked about this on previous episodes. My hypothesis is that until we get to like a truly trusted and open marketplace that is accessing the kind of that TAM, right? You will have this continual price compression, and then the winners will be defined by those who create the operational efficiency. Like we've seen this in like pretty much every consumer category in the US. Like people create operational efficiency. The small business have a hard time competing, And, there's always this craft layer, but the bulk of the revenues will be in like who can do it the best, the most consistent at scale at a low price. And then that will win out for some time until people get tired of consuming that. And then like that will kind of build back the opportunity for premiumization and craft. And what I've found over the years in all these different markets is that flower is the most susceptible to it because people like to try around, and there's not a lot of brand loyalty. At the end of the day, when you look at one flower to the next, it doesn't have a brand name on it once you take it out of the packaging. And the further you get away from the flower, low dose beverages, like that's where it's all about the brand and the flavor of the liquid, of course, but like understanding that everyone can go out and hire a good formulator, it just all becomes about brand loyalty. And so it's like that's where beverages and gummies start to win and build loyalty. We've seen it with brands, and that's where operational efficiency becomes really important. Like how efficiently can you create those units, and how consistent can they be? So yeah, I hate to say it, like we can get really nuanced with all these conversations and have all these hypotheses, but at the end of the day, I feel like we're going to be having this conversation for the next decade.
Yeah. We're having a conversation in real time about what will win and succeed as we sort of watch it in real time. Like it's like whatever's happening is happening. It's very of the moment.
I think the two other challenges that play into it is more one, cities, it's a little where the access, you can basically walk a couple more blocks or drive a couple more blocks, and there's a competitor selling the same product for less. The dynamic there is a little different. That makes it harder to be less competitive on price. But also you've got, in the past, 6 years now, we've had a lot of inflation. And so it's also, we're trying to deal with these problems at a time when people have, every day of less disposable income than they did, in the 2000s and 2010s. Just general, being very generalized, but so, it's also the industry is trying to fight that problem at the time that it's going through these expansion dynamics.
Yeah. One thing that I think a lot of the conversation, we featured a conversation that Chris Kasakia had for our platform today. It's in today's newsletter, cultivated.news. A conversation with the new head of the DCC in California. I think California is one of those C's, actually. No, California's DCC, Department of Cannabis Control. Is that the right lingo?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And they are combating almost $6 billion of what they view as sort of unregulated cannabis sales. And he's got a 4-tiered approach to sort of combat this. One, promote trusted and safe products through traditional licensing and compliance work, sustain enforcement on the illicit market, public awareness campaigns steering consumers to licensed retailers, and reducing regulatory burdens on compliant operators. He did note, though, that there really isn't a silver bullet. It's a little bit of this, all of those things, plus. Jared, we're going to have Clint on next week, I think, but a pretty interesting read and conversation that he had with Chris.
Yeah, we're looking forward to getting into all those issues with him on the show. Just two top line things that I thought were pretty interesting. One is the acknowledgement that California has a serious problem. I mean, one of his first answers to Chris was that, I think it was, what was the number? 40%. Sorry, let me fact check myself here.
Yeah. Something like that.
Yeah, legal California cannabis captures just 40% of sales. In Canada, some of the numbers I've seen, over the same time frame are upwards of 70%. So clearly, that's a real bad problem. And I think too, the second piece is that they're focused on enforcement, right? Like that was sort of anathema to how a lot of these cannabis regulatory agencies worked over the past few years. And now they're saying, look, like enforcement's a real problem. We need to ramp it up. It needs to go through proper channels. And so, I think those two things, one is that there is a problem. He's new in the job. And two, that they are planning to ramp up enforcement in a real way. Like we'll see where that goes, but I'm excited to get into those issues. And I thought that was notable because that's sort of a change in tune. And, Ben and Mark, I know you're in California, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems like a change in tune from prior leadership.
Yeah. Look, I mean, DCC lost a court case not too long ago about their lack of enforcement of their own rules, and so
Right.
that is a clear opportunity for improvement. But I don't know. I'm a skeptic. I just don't think enforcement alone is going to solve the problems. Like, you have to create a viable marketplace. Like I keep saying, like I've talked to a lot of growers up in the North counties, and the ones that have tried to make a go of the legal landscape, like they've all died.
Right.
Metaphor,
Right.
figuratively, the companies. And like, you need, like, if you're going to enforce it and you're going to like encourage people to get into the legal marketplace, you got to make it possible for them to live, right? Like to thrive. And I see we're currently, in a legislative session in California, and there are new rules trying to be implemented by the assembly people. And it's just like they're pointing out all these problems, and it really does. It's like, well, if DCC did their job, like that would be, like, we don't need more rules. We just need the DCC to do their job.
That's fair. That's fair.
Fair. Yeah.
Mark, I want to go. So yes to all that, and we'll have more next week. We'll have some pull quotes as well from where Jeremy grills him. But Mark, you wrote this week. It was a little bit of sort of what Ben was talking about, that not exactly, but 2026, the year of the prohibitionist, but there is an increased pushback. And you wrote a great Cannabis Musings, which I would direct everybody to. This is one of my favorite pull quotes because you were actually talking about Malcolm Gladwell. The industry has made so much progress since the tipping point. Talk a little bit about what you wrote about this week, and we'll put up how to get in touch with you and read your stuff as well.
I appreciate that. Now, it was actually sparked by last week's conversation on this stream that there really has been this pushback, and just trying to sort of put it in a little bit of context, think about the problem a little bit more, where we've seen it from. That the mention about Gladwell was about an article he wrote, tipped off of Alex Berenson's book, I guess is one word for it, from
Screed.
like 2019, Screed, with a lot of misinformation that's been shown to be misinformation about cannabis. But also just thinking about, where does it sort of sit, in this sort of trend in the past 18 months since the Trump administration took over. And, this is not I'm not criticizing the Trump administration. It's more just, I'm just trying to like think about, this is what's happened. And and there has been this, it may not be causation, but there's definitely a correlation of, with these sort of social movements and public health movements. And I think that cannabis is, to a certain extent, getting caught up in it.
Yes. And I listened to a podcast, and this is an obscure episode of a pretty popular podcast, but this week, The Bulwark, sort of my center-right listening podcast, had this woman, Ashley St. Clair, who was like a MAGA, like influencer type. She's also the mother of one of Elon Musk's kids, and they're embroiled in a whole lawsuit. Doesn't matter. But she was talking about in her podcast, in this podcast that I was listening to, that the concerted effort around any issue is being well funded and well coordinated. So like, I'm not saying this is one of those cases, but when you see all of a sudden during 1 week, huge pushback from sort of the MAGA circle or the Maha circle, whatever it is, it is not a leap to say that it is a concerted, well-funded effort to push back against these things, which clicked into my mind. Like when we see all of a sudden, not just Berrenson, but a whole bunch of others fighting against this, it is concerted. There are message points going out. There's money exchanged on this front. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, except sometimes.
No, you're right. I mean, the incentives on Elon Musk's own social media platform would show that can be a very lucrative, not very lucrative, a somewhat lucrative business for social media influencers to get payments and latch on to very clicky, hot button social issues and advocate for one side. I absolutely believe that. We
need to get on that. Where's the
money? Jay, I don't need the money.
We're running a huge media empire.
I'd rather not. I'd rather build it the right way.
Right. Fair enough. No, I mean, look, there's
Ben.
What's
No,
that?
I was just gonna say I love the reference to the tipping point for a number of reasons. I think it's a really great book, but also how many times have we heard the phrase tipping point? I think the industry generally all agreed to stop saying it, but like at least in the first 5 years in the industry, it was like there's 3 tipping points that we were hitting, and every time it turned out not to be the tipping point.
Well, I have one.
The CISO went back up.
I actually have one ready to go. You want to hear a tipping point?
Yeah.
I have it ready to go. Are you ready?
It's a good tipping point.
I mean, it was the word tipping point was mentioned several times right after he said that.
Today, I'm pleased to announce that I will be signing an executive order to reschedule marijuana from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3 controlled substance with legitimate medical uses. We have people begging for me to do this, people that are in great pain. For decades, this action has been requested by American patients suffering from extreme pain, incurable diseases.
Him off. Can't listen to him anymore. But that was a tipping point from December. And now we are January, February, March. 3 months hence.
Yeah.
Still tipping.
We're still the slow tipping point.
The seesaw is still,
taking tips.
Very slow tipping point. But as we wrap up today's show, first I want to thank you, Ben, Mark, and Jeremy for joining us. But also, let's hope we have a tipping point to talk about between now and next Friday. No matter how slow that pendulum moves, or the tipping point points or tips, I guess. Whatever the metaphor is, I've ruined it. We'll cover whatever.
I think you said Benjamin, not pendulum. So that was a nice Freudian slip. Yeah, he did.
I was trying to say Ben and pendulum at the same time. It's pendulum. Ben, Mark, Jeremy, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for joining us here on This Week in Cannabis Live. Find us at cultivated.news. Find Mark at Cannabis Musings. Find Ben at High Spirits. You can find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and especially on LinkedIn. I like following you guys on LinkedIn. Thanks everybody. Have a good weekend.